we're going to talk about case studies and case-based learning. You know, I looked up case studies and then I remembered that I did a case study for my dissertation. And it's not the same as what we're talking about today, right? It's not a research case study that we've researched. But instead it's a case that or an example of a real life situation or potentially real life situation that our students might run into someday. And by having them go through this sort of, or talk through this sort of, what would happen if this situation happened, they learn and can apply some of the concepts that hopefully they're learning. Is that about right? Does that sound-ish, right-ish? Let's start off by talking, having some questions, any things that anyone is dying to hear about today or would like to know more about, and we'll try to hit those. Or really important points that you're like, if there's one thing I want to share today, it's, yes, Karen.
One thing that I'm curious about, hopefully like I'm in the right place for that, is just like ideal timeline for case studies. Like when is it ideal to introduce? When is it ideal to have students working on it and then have a deadline? So just trying to think more about timelines.
Timeline, I'm going to add appropriateness. So what things are good and what things are not. Good question. When to do them, why to do them. Yes.
Kind of related to that, I'm also curious about how to assess whether the main point that you're trying to get across with the case scenario has been gotten by the students.
Assessment, is it success? And maybe it's not so much assessment as much as it is evaluation. Assessment implies the grade that they get, and evaluation is really about.
Yeah, and even how much do you explicitly tell them, here's the thing you should have gotten from this, or something, even if not assessment. Here's the main point.
Assess of learning objectives. Good. Yeah, Jerry.
So this is, I guess, an owner-operator issue, but it came up this week when I was communicating with you, is where are they supposed to live? Because we just ran into the problem. I realized that all my links were broken because our department isn't going to keep their servers anymore. And then I started looking around and I'm like, where am I supposed to house this thing?
Which type of cases do you have right now?
I have the community development or rank imperialism.
What are they based on right now?
Yes,
What
sorry. I built it with the do it individual, so I didn't build it, so it's CS.
It looks like CSCR.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, so that's being phased out.
Awesome.
I'll talk about the replacement.
All right, so this brings up the question of longevity. Good, that's a good one.
Well, and what other tools there are besides CSCR, because I have other instructors that are still using it.
Tools and options, good.
So we're busy.
And Susan might say something that, you know, if this were done in analog, you just have them in your file.
Depends on what you're doing.
Right. But yeah, the technology enhanced ones are getting a little bit harder. Other thoughts, questions? All right, can we hear from the, oh, you guys are all lined up here. I didn't mean for that to happen.
Oh.
All right,
We can
so
move.
let me just explain this. One of the things that we changed the format from previous years of doing the active teaching lab, where we would have one person come up and talk about what they wanted, what they tried, what happened, what they do the next time, sort of a lessons learned thing, right? And it was always very much a standing in front of the room like I'm doing right now with this thing right here. And I thought, well, that's great, but wouldn't it be cool to get more people involved? But I don't want it to be a panel where I have you all sit up front, because there's a weird power dynamic with that. where you guys have to be experts then because you're sitting in the front and everyone else can't say anything because they aren't being affected. If you have examples of case studies, no matter where you sit, or case scenarios or cases, and you use that, share what you know. Share your experiences if you've gone through it as students. That said, I have planted some people in the audience here already, the participants in the audience, to come talk about these things and talk about what they do. So can you guys just share what it is that you do? And I don't care who starts.
I go first.
Yeah, Mike.
So, we were using CSCR very exclusive.
And
very
where are
heavily.
you?
I'm at school pharmacy and Amy Child's work with me also. And so we actually are a support group that does it, but I'm also faculty, so I understand what the faculty are trying to do, but I can interpret for them what we're trying to do for them. And we were using CSCR and, but it doesn't track anymore. You can still use it, but the tool is getting, uses Flash and a bunch of other stuff, and Flash is sort of going by the wayside and stuff. So
CSCR, by the way, is case scenario / critical reader. It is a tool that was developed here on campus. I do it 7, 8, 9 years ago. And we found that it is harder and harder to sort of keep going because the rest of the world is changing and we don't have the money to, we'd have to totally rewrite it.
one of the decisions was, do we rewrite it or do we use some software off the shelf that's already available? And so the campus moved to 2 different tools to replace it. One is Storyline, which does more of the case scenario part, and then it's the books to replace the critical reader part of it. So they have replacements for them.
In the activity sheet, you will see that there are links to some of these. You'll also notice that the paper copy links don't work. But if you join our site, our course, under this Lab Essentials and How To, then everything in there you can get in, then you can start playing with, including playing with some of the cases that our contributors have shared with us online.
Are we supposed to be able to enter that course there?
No.
Or is that just a
This
This
one-
course, I'll explain more detail why it's not gonna get there. And so the nice thing about if you use the Storyline, then there's a piece called Raspberry behind it. You can actually put stuff in, actually track it and grade it and all that kind of stuff and keep track of all what case scenario did. So it pretty much does all those type of features. That this pretty much came online about March or April of this year. So it's been sort of a long, drawn out process to get to that point, but now it's a supported project. Storyline itself is supported from Articulate. The problem is it's not a cheap piece of software to use, is the disadvantage of it, and they know that. And so they're trying to get a better, lower price of that right now. There's until I think it's November or something like that, you can actually ask for use of the software, and they have a way of using it right now, but it's not long-term, that you have to buy it if you want to use it long-term.
I think we have 50 licenses
Correct.
on campus that you can, if you need to access it, you can access it.
And that's one of the ideas that we know there's a problem with that, and they're trying to figure out that part of it.
Yeah.
Do you want me to demo a little bit of what I have? Or do you want me to wait? And then the second one is like we have a static electronic health record, which is sort of Epic looking. But to do stuff from Epic, you gotta go, if you wanna do something 2 years in advance, you have to go 2 years and wait 2 years before the next piece. And it's not very easy to build an Epic itself, so we made a mock chart that looks like Epic, but we have a lot of charts that we use for pharmacy for the pharmacies.
Let's hold off on the demo just for a little bit and hear from everyone else about it.
And that's built in something we did ourselves because it's running off of WordPress, but we have a plugin that says only students that come out of that course can see it. So if we want to use it for exams, they can't share the link with anybody else. And that's a real little piece that handles it. And both of these are assignments, and so you can give credits for looking at it and stuff too if you want to.
So once we start talking about the technology behind it and the back end of it, things get really complicated
Yes.
really fast.
Yes, very much so.
Well, if we go to the other end, so I'm Jerry Barak, I am in the Department of Plant Pathology, and I teach the anchor course for a FIG. And so apparently back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I created this case study with really fantastic group to it. And so I don't know anything about the technology, and but I actually learned a lot of pedagogy working with the Do It team about how to roll out a successful case study. And ironically, when I was talking to John earlier this week, is I was going to put a sunset this year on this case study because the world is changing. So the way this case study works is is that the student pretends like they've done an internship in Ethiopia and they have to write a memo to the minister. They have to go out and they have to interview a bunch of people and then they have to write this memo. And this is not unlike how our legislative aides operate in Washington DC. And so that's how it's supposed to mirror the real world. And between when we developed it and today, Ethiopia has changed. And so already, like, it can't be a static thing if the students are gonna buy into it. And so I think that's a big challenge is for faculty like myself that don't know anything about how to build something like this is I can come up with the stories, I can bring in the information and all that stuff, but there's no way I can do this by myself. And there's no one else in my department that does anything like this. And so I would have to go to the college at large, or I would have to partner with someone else.
So that was one of the things, and when we talked about pedagogy, you talked about sort of the authenticity. Is this an actual thing that is happening right now? No, it's changed now, so the world has changed. We need to adapt our cases accordingly, so there's more work to end up having to do over again sometimes, which gets to the longevity of the tool that we're talking about. And even if you use Storyline or Articulate or Pressbooks, there's a very good chance that what you create now, you might have to change or redo next year, or 2 years, or 5 years, or whatever. Is it easy to do that? No, it's not. Not yet. Are there ways that you can make things sort of modular so that only parts need to be changed, or they're easier to manage chunks rather than building everything in sort of whatever the tool is? Yes. And in many ways, this parallels Canvas, right? Your Canvas courses, how many of you had any problems moving from Desire to Learn to Canvas? Because you had built stuff in Desire to Learn and now you had to rebuild it in Canvas. It's the same thing in any technology in case scenarios especially.
John, I just want to mention that, even though like your case scenario changed, there might be some level of okayness with that in that, you can maybe present the historical way that transpired and then use that as, if you're trying to get authenticity in the activity itself, well, that doesn't really work. But you can use it to say like, hey, this is what used to happen. Now that we're done with this activity, let's compare with what they do nowadays.
Yeah.
So when you're designing your activities, you can think about, well, if this does change, how okay will I be with that?
Yeah.
And what can I do when
How might this degrade, and what are the things that I can build into it that will be timeless, more timeless? Good. Thank you, Jerry.
I'll jump in. So I'm Susan LaBelle, and probably different from everybody in here. So I teach in Masters of Science and Biotechnology program, which is an executive program. And our curriculum includes science as well as business aspects. And I teach the last of 3 business courses. And in our business courses, one of the challenges that we have is, of course, the fact that most of our students have an undergraduate degree or even a graduate degree in science. And so my challenge, of course, is to bridge that gap between science and business. So case studies are incredibly helpful in that. My career has been in the industrial world, in the world of science business. And so I am familiar with case studies in a very broad sense, clinical case studies, customer case studies, and these are classic business case studies that we use. So when you're talking about that sort of longevity, content longevity is a huge issue in our course. And it's a big issue for me because we use Harvard Business Review, we use Northwestern cases, but because we're looking for something that's specific to biotechnology or pharmaceuticals, 99.9% of the cases that are published out there are about things like consumer products, right? And so we have old cases. We know they're old, but they're still relevant because the decision-making process, whatever. The challenge is, of course, students can go find what happened. And so one of the things that we have to get to them all the time is what happened is separate from what you would recommend, right? the case stands on its own as an analytical tool and a tool to synthesize and come up with a recommendation. What happened doesn't mean that it was a good idea or a bad idea. So that's a big challenge when we're using something old. We wish we didn't have to. And in fact, this past year, in order to synthesize all these ideas that we learned through each case into one case, I actually had to write a case, which I hadn't done since business school, which was a really long time ago. But it was the only way for me to pull all the pieces from the other cases together. We are totally analog, I will guarantee you that, because we gain nothing by going. We gain nothing, I don't think, by adapting a technology to what we're trying to do. We're discussing them in class where, I have some examples of how we present ideas in class and what we do, but that longevity of content is a huge issue, but I can't solve it easily, So getting students out of this attitude that there's, first of all, a right answer, because there isn't always a right answer. But there is something I want them to get out of it, right? And we use a rubric to try to get them to understand. And it's I think it's a fairly different kind of rubric, frankly. It's sort of like, there was the idea, here's what I hoped you'd get, here's all the common mistakes people make. So anyway, that's what we do.
I would love to follow up on that and see an example of the kinds of rubrics that you make, because that seems like an interesting thing for me to look into.
Well, it's, because it's an enduring tool then as they continue to build through their class and get to the capstone project, to look at it and say, I shouldn't have screwed up that way, or I should have done this, or here's how people comment.
Guess what we're having an active teaching lab session on?
I know, I saw that.
Sure. I'm Karen Kravinoff. I'm in the School of Medicine and Public Health 104 anatomists. So we used to teach undergrads as well. Now we're totally involved in the professional programs. So MD, physician assistant, physical and occupational therapy. So our subject matter totally lends itself to cases and scenarios in real life. You need to get that foundation of what the building blocks of the anatomy are. But students, at least early students, tend to think of things independently and not how they work together. So we've got several different kinds of cases or real life scenarios, some in which, and it's posted here, is like, what happens when you eat lunch? So to think about all the different anatomical structures and nerves and muscles, et cetera, that are involved, and not what each one of them does independently, but how they're all going to cooperate in a way that makes just this unconscious sort of activity happen without you knowing it. And then all kinds of injuries and those sorts of maybe more traditional medical cases. Being part of the med school and all these professional programs means the really applied anatomy of what we do is what's fundamentally important truly for the students. It's like, yeah, it's good to know the body parts, but they need to deal with what happens when people have disease, things go wrong, diagnostics, things like that. And they have a really hard time, as I'm sure in any discipline you could echo. You give them all the basics, but they can't think about it in a real life way unless you coach them how to do that. So we're essentially coaching them how to think of things in a different way. All our assessments are case scenarios, putting things in context for questions. So we use these time-wise after dissections, lectures, kind of as a review application activity prior to an assessment to get their brains thinking along those lines.
So let's talk a little bit about right answers. How many of your cases have right answers in the online versions?
So our students have to write stuff after the fact. These are just data gathering parts too.
Okay. So in addition to the case, then they have sort of a reflection piece afterwards.
It's actually more like, what would I write in my note if I was a pharmacist at the location?
Okay.
Because I have to write that note. Not, the early students don't write it as elaborate as we
And
go
actually,
along.
let's go ahead and look at yours. And I want to note, so Mike and Amy's is not on our Active Teaching Lab course page again, but the other ones are. So you can just go ahead and people have very kindly shared them so we can go through them, and you can go through them on your own time as well. But let's here, come on up and demo yours if you would.
The things
what-
left off were the ones at the end, so I don't actually go through the whole thing, because I can show the end, I'm gonna show the end first.
That's fine, that's wonderful.
You have to use the mouse.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh,
My trackpad died on me.
okay, that helps. I thought, am I doing something wrong? Oh, sorry. So the beginning is walk through what you're gonna do, so, and then it's sort of asking, you wanna ask more questions, this is a senior person coming in asking for help with a product. And this is all, and, so you can ask bad questions.
Last night, I started getting.
And so it feeds back to that.
Something, but I could still breathe out a part of it. I don't really have any others.
I just don't, you know, listen to it, then it tells you if you did a good job, you didn't get all the right questions right, it could put you back again to ask the questions, to get the right questions. It does that looping for about 5 or 6 times, so artificial intelligence isn't quite where it needs to be, so this is our version of trying to group them together, but not seeing 30 questions to ask. We try to group them into categories, when they're grouped together in series of where you would ask those questions, because there's scenarios for that part. They go through all that part, when they get done to the end, they have a couple more questions, and then they have a button to click that gives a whole sheet of what product would you pick, and they fill out the whole theory behind that part of it. Some other ones we have like this, they actually are interviewing a patient in the hospital. Other ones are actually interviewing physicians to ask questions of physicians. We have some that are mixing drugs together, which ones work together. So we've done these type of models for different scenarios for type of things. And this is all done in Storyline. Before this was CSCR, so we just took the same model and moved them over. And then behind the scenes, there's scoring, so you can track through what they did.
So Mike, how long would you say it took you to do the initial design,
Wait, the initial design in CSCR, initial design, it moved from CSCR to Storyline.
The initial CSCR, I guess, rather than the putting it into the technology, but just the thinking about
Yeah.
what's gonna happen.
So normally we template these out in PowerPoint. This seems to be the easiest way that the faculty get to us.
Okay.
It's the first design, we sat down with 2 or 3 faculty, actually Tim sat in with us and Blair, and we actually, I think we met for like a couple months and for every couple weeks to map out a design that worked.
Okay.
And then some of these have, this one's because it's over in a community pharmacy, they don't have a chart or anything like that. Some more elaborate ones have buttons to take them to the note where they write the SOAP note to see electronic chart, to see other resources for guidelines. So some have gotten very elaborate for what they have with them.
So that's another thing I want to talk about is complexity, and how complex do they need to be to get the points apart,
So
get the
what,
points
well,
across?
the other thing is these become, when we first get the students, these are very, very simple. And as we move through the curriculum, they get more and more complex. They have multiple diseases going on, and more distractors. At first, they have very few distractors. As we go through it, they become more distractors like you have in real life.
So in some ways, it's like a fish tanking where you say, all right, here's the water and the sand and one fish.
Yeah.
And then later on in the semester, we're like, all right, now we got 2 fish. How do they interact?
Yeah.
And so they learn, so there's some scaffolding there.
And so
Good. And this gets to the timeline question about when is it appropriate to do what? How many of those of you who have seen cases have seen or built cases that you say now are way too complex for what they've been, for what they were done, what they're meant for?
we've had some of those, we took pieces out because
Okay.
students got lost in them.
And that's, I think, once you get into a technology and you figure out the technology, there's the lure of the technology, like, oh, we can make this more complex, let's add this too, let's add this too, let's add this too. And sometimes you've got to go back and say, all right, wait a second, what are the essential things in this lesson? And what are the nice to know and what are the, oh, that's kind of interesting things.
And then some of the ones we had, they pick a product and go through it, and if they pick the wrong product, we tell them what would happen. And then say, well, the physician stepped in or your preceptor stepped in and fixed it for you and put you back on track.
Oh, nice. It was like, something happened, you're
Yeah, so
good again.
Most of these have a preceptor helping them, so they have sort of a guide to guide them through. And so there's an outside guide that walks them through the process that would normally happen in life, so they're not stuck out here this floundering.
And keeping the things simple versus complex might also help you with the longevity aspect of it, because if they're smaller modules, they're easier to fix, and you can be like, okay, got that one done. This one, I guess we don't really need it. And it's also less time for the students to get into it, which means that it's less time for them to get lost in it. And it's the more discrete parts makes it easier for them to sort of deal with.
I think it's interesting that the idea of having a progressively complex, challenging series of cases that are testing you to get better at whatever you're trying to teach. I think my thought of case studies is thematic, like what we do.
But
We're
they're,
teaching
they're,
different concepts.
thematic too, but they're also, cases get more complex. So we do both, and so we bring ideas back from the first, it's a 4-semester sequence, we bring back the first semester things, they show back up in the 3rd semester.
Yeah. Well, I guess the one that you did write did sort of combine all of the separate themes.
Yeah,
into more
but yeah, I mean, we're talking about case studies that are, written out at 15 to 20 pages and financial tables and stuff that wouldn't necessarily lend itself to that. But some of our earlier stuff we do, like earlier in the course, there might be reasons to do things this way.
Yeah.
Might be an interesting adaptation for all of our cases through the 2 years are done in teams. But we do, in my class, ask them to do something individually as well. And so there might be something on that individual component to layer on top of the team activity so that every individual is engaged. Because one of the problems we have, when you have a team doing something, you got 6 people, 4 of them are doing the work and they're dividing it up. And so, if you force the individual student to go back in terms of content or key issues in something like that, that might be a really interesting way to reinforce those key thoughts, either before or after.
And so like the Adam I showed you here used to be paper, and they would just show them, here's the answers to the
Right.
questions that were right, there was no distractors.
Right.
And so the students didn't really get an idea of how to ask questions, and sometimes we actually have closed-ended, open-ended questions, so a lot of people ask yes, no, and that's not how you're supposed to do it, so we actually throw
Right.
those into.
Yeah.
I'll show my other piece then, so.
Can I just ask a question for you?
Sure.
Because I like it here where you take it through it, but what you're still basically giving students a set of like 4 actions to choose from. So you're
Right.
still sort of giving them what to do.
But
Can
there's
you
like,
just sort of
there's
more
like
open
6 or
ended?
7 sets of those type of 4 questions, so it goes through a whole bunch of pieces. One time we used to, at one time before we started getting into this, we used to ask what are the questions you want to ask, but they were asking, they got out of sequence because they were asking questions that were later on in the process. But we have to figure out the best way to get around that until artificial intelligence gets better at looking for keywords.
And I think that, one of the areas that when I think of case studies, I think of video games and how they can take what you do and say, all right, let's run with this for a while until you find out, is this gonna work, is this not gonna work? What, your strategy, your chosen decision. And those are getting better and better at that artificial intelligence of like, people aren't, what we're doing here in many cases is saying, okay, it's almost like a slide deck. If you click here, you go to this step. And you've got to design all that. And that is very quickly able to get overwhelming and confusing. But if you've got $100 million and 300 people working on this video game, then some of that gets a little bit easier.
This, I'll show you the electronic chart this too. And so there's this different pieces of, this is how Epic would look when you go to the doctor's office. It's just all broken apart that way, but this has a lot of tabs, so there might only be 4 tabs for the first students when they first come in with very minimal type data. Let's see. But then notes gets into all the doctor's notes. You have tabs, so this is a very elaborate one. It's going to take a while to read. So this used to be just running your big long piece of paper, but then they got out to Epic go, can't see my long note, just read through the whole thing. They actually have to sort of think about how they're going to navigate through the chart. That's how it is. And we have a large amount of these built out now. And this is built on WordPress because we can control it better. We used to have it in Canvas, and every time Canvas was changing stuff, that our tabs would go away or not work. And so then it didn't work out well, so we took it out of Canvas entirely and totally thrown out how it looks. Nice thing is then these links stay active year to year. We don't fix the links also.
And so really the decision or the way that they move through this, it's not like choose the right answer. It's like, which is the one that is the most efficient.
No, they have to
for me
read all the different parts. Which parts do I need to read? And
It's
or what the case is.
strategizing.
Yes, and they may not need all the tabs, but they're all there.
And in some ways, there's some red herrings. And I think that
Oh, yes.
when you talked about all the financial tables and things in these 50-page things, there are probably some built-in like, you can go down this path if you'd like, but part of what you need to learn here is how to do this efficiently, how to make these decisions well.
And so normally we have this part plus the other part put together, or sometimes just a chart by itself.
Very good, thank you.
Sure.
All right, so how does that contrast with Karen, yours, or Susan? Let's talk about yours. Do you want to talk about your slides here?
Yeah, ours are really different. As I mentioned, we are using Harvard Business Review and Northwestern case studies. And they are case studies built up on actual companies, in our case, pharmaceutical companies who have had to make a decision about acquiring a product or whatever. They're 20 sort of pages long, most of them, and a lot of financial information. We assign them to students in a team. So the team is working on the case. And the two things that I brought here just to share is the way we ask them to present back, and not so much how to think about the case, because we give them some a lot. We tell them it's analysis plus synthesis and not just pull it out of your rear. But they're stories, right? I mean, they're 20 pages of, here's a background on this guy who's the CEO and this person. And there are some things in there that are not relevant. But they could be relevant should the students choose to go down a certain path. So when we ask them to present, we ask them to present from the perspective that they're a consultant to the board of directors. And so that's how they're doing this. And it's to try to keep them off of case background, because one of the things they do is they're like, well, the company's this big and it's this big, we don't care. We're trying to get to the meat of the matter. Make sure that they identify what the specific problem is that they're going to address. And again, we don't tell them what the problem is. We give them a question that just says, what should they do? Or, how would you have proceeded? They're very general. Can they take those relevant pieces, and then we give them specific analytical frameworks to work on too. So are they picking the right model to use, and are they picking the right pieces of information from the case? Are they making recommendations that follow logically? This is a huge issue, and it's probably one of our biggest issues, is because they do it by a team, they divide and conquer, and then and I'll show you the form, we do use a PowerPoint format, which was really new to me, and I fought it for a while, but I think I like it now.
How big are your groups again?
Pardon?
The teams that are working on this, how big are they? How many?
5 to 6, depends on the size of the class, but I usually try to keep them around 4 or 5. And so they are supposed to be then presenting this coherent story, but you can tell if there were 6 of them and we use 6-slide format, that 6 people each put together a slide. Then they get up and one by one present, and you're like, and the story is what, right? So that whole notion of the analysis that they're doing, again, trying to get scientifically trained people to understand the analytical impact on a very nebulous business case is quite a challenge. So what's their logic? A lot of times what I see as a big issue is we ask them to outline their assumptions, but many times they're not grounded in the actual facts of the case. They just sort of pull them from the air. Oh, we think they should go to Germany. And we're like, what? Where'd you get that? We made the assumption they were successful in Germany. We're like, Germany's not part of it. So that's interesting. Their idea of an assumption is a little different than I keep saying. You're scientists. You know what an assumption is. And then, how are they going to address those challenges, those things that we want them to think about that are even outside the case? Who are they competing with? So that's the approach we ask them to take. And then we don't write them up, if you want to show, yes. So we don't write them up as a written document, which is the way I learned, it's the way I have done case studies before, even as an individual or a group. We actually force them to use 6 PowerPoint slides. And they're presenting to the class, so the way it works is one group is selected that morning to present that evening. So they all have to do this as though they may have to be called on. And so one group presents to the class, and it's not so much that it's they did it right or wrong, it's just to get the conversation started. So what we tell them they have to do is that this slide deck has to stand on its own. So if they dropped it in the hallway and I picked it up, I would understand all the key points that we asked them to do. And we ask them to title the slides. This is the hardest thing they deal with, is to title the slides so that the takeaway is in the title, right? It's, we don't want a title that says, this is this model. we're like, we know that's the model, right? We want you to tell us, we want strong internal capabilities limit the threat, as opposed to, here's the model I used. So that's the way we do it. They talk, we end up with, this kind of conversation so that everybody can, sort of, well, my group looked at it this way, my group looked at it that way. Then the other thing that we do to make sure that every individual student is engaged is whether or not they're on a team. We don't assign every case to every team. We ask everybody to fill in one of these Qualtrics surveys. So they have to give some thought about which of these things do you think is the biggest influencer, what steps would you take, to what extent are they gonna make it, is it a bad deal, is it a good deal? And we always ask them whether they would hold shares, sell shares, or buy shares. Because that's a way to sort of get them down to it. And then during the class, we show them what that distribution is. And it gives us a way, we know who answered what because we require their names. So if somebody's not participating, it's really easy to say, well, you're the only person who said they were gonna sell. So why don't you tell us why you thought this was a bad deal? There every once in a while, we get a couple of those wimps that drives the faculty nuts. But that's kind of how we use them. And so it's very different because there really literally is no right answer. What I tell them is the only wrong answer is if your answer's not supported by your analysis, if you're just pulling this out of the literature or someplace. These are very classic business cases.
Are the way you're implementing this, is this reflective of sort of like your style of teaching, or is this reflective of the Wisconsin School of Business?
Well, this was, certainly the presentation was definitely the preference of the faculty lead that I was working with. One of our faculty lecturers does not like the PowerPoints at all, wants everybody to write up like a 10-page paper. I'm like, won't happen, but every year we talk about it. But that's his preference in terms of the actual outcome of it. But sort of the overall application is just very classic business school.
And I've got a link in this, which it links to the Harvard Business cases, and some of them are available for free if you sign up for an educator account, which you can open. They perfectly so easy. But then there's a video of them facilitating one of these, which is kind of a neat thing. So if you're interested in facilitating a discussion-based class case, there's information on the activity sheet that you can go see how that happens. So based on what we've heard so far, and I still want to get more from Karen and Jerry, what are the issues that we're starting to come up with? What are we seeing? Any more thoughts on what we've got written on the board over there? Any answers? Have any of you, anyone else, have you tried to make cases? What are your experiences? What were your experiences? AJ, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about it. I have a note to go back and rethink. The two main places, so I work with ITA and do it. It's a high school training technology program, to be really simplifying what we do. So we teach about computer hardware and like fixing computers. And so we use some case studies for that. It's evolved a very small amount into what it's like to get a help desk call and like how to walk through the steps. And then the other one we do is we do a program called Get Invested, where it's like an entrepreneurial shift program for high school students. So we use case studies like basically how a business came up with a problem and then a solution and then where they are today. In both cases though, it's not as interactive as I think it should be, especially for a high school audience. So I'm just thinking about that.
So there's something about that, right? Because when we have anything that we present online, today, all people, immediately compare it to other things that they've experienced online. If we make a video, they compare it to the Titanic. If we make a video game or simulation, they compare it to Grand Theft Auto or Fortnite or whatever it is. And we can be really good and we just got a $100,000 grant to build this game, and that game's gonna look terrible. Our case, the best that we can do is gonna look terrible compared to their expectations. And this kind of gets into one of the areas that I really like is, what would happen if we assigned them to make cases? Because then all of a sudden, their expectations go way down. And their expectations of what you do in your class and the cases that they have to undergo experience, go way down, because now they have a chance to say, oh, this is really hard to do this. What do I leave in? What do I take out? What are the most essential things? Actually, what Karen, Jerry, Susan, these aren't so bad, right? So I think that was a really neat point of like, where are our expectations, and it's not interactive enough for them, and it can't be. We can't do it. We've got the rest of our lives to do.
So when you assign a case study to the students, what kind of tool would you suggest they do then?
Well, so
Storyline's not.
I don't know if there's a right answer to that one either, right?
Yeah.
I love the universal design for learning, so I think that some people might be able to do a video case. I've had students do one of those YouTube choose your own adventure things where they stop at the end of the video and, do you choose X or do you choose Y? And then they acted out the next section of it. I've had them do the, what was that big thing in the 80s? Sort of an electronic choose your own adventure. What?
Wagon train over
That was so this is your own adventure thing. I've seen some online versions of it. You can do it with hyperlinks, right? Where they just start putting together one. On the activity sheet, I've got a link to Jen Reinhardt came 2 years ago, and she actually did one in Canvas. And it was how do I treat this poor dog who shows up and who's a vet med. One of your students? No, vet med, I'm sorry. Yeah.
But you gotta be careful how you name your pages.
What's that?
You gotta be careful how you name your pages, because
Right.
she named her pages 1, 2, 3, 4, so the students have figured it out and they jumped to 6.
Right. And that was one of the things. It's just like in if you use a photo here and they roll over the photo, they can see the name of the photo through the alt text. If you roll your name over this, it shows up down here. And if you named it right answer, they can choose that. But it was a really neat thing. And she used this very simple tool that we're all starting to figure out how to do in order to make this branching narrative that they could choose positives and negatives on.
There's a twine.
Twinery.org or twinery.com.
.org, yeah.
Yeah, is another one. And there are several others on that activity sheet for Jen Reinhardt. I talk about, or I link to several others like Twinery, that software that will help you navigate and help design. How do I design this branching narrative? It's really hard to do that unless you've got a huge whiteboard or some software to help you, because it's easy to get lost and have dead ends and such.
So with regards to the how the students deliver their case study, giving them several options, and especially giving them an open-ended one, that maybe you even say you approve or whatever. The caveat is that some students might want to do one of those because it sounds really appealing, but they could
And they
very
get lost.
easily get in over their head.
Yeah.
So if you're giving specific options, make sure you give details about the pros and cons, and how to execute those things if they're somewhat anonymous in there, and maybe even just have an approval process to say yes, you can go ahead with your
Right. And maybe even making one, having the students make one, like that's not a day one assignment or a week one or beginning of the semester assignment. That's like one final project sort of thing. Having them find examples online, having them even make a pitch for one, or put together a storyboard for one. Those are all things that are much easier for them to do, that keep the technology side, which can be very quickly overwhelming, as we've talked about, out of it, and focus more on the thinking. Have them do an analog one, have them do a PowerPoint
You have to
template.
have them do a word-based one.
Yeah.
And then, because then there's really no technology involved, but at least they have to think about all the pieces they have to have.
Yeah.
And there's also equity in grading too that you need to consider, so that regardless of whichever option you choose to deliver your final project, that there are aspects of your project that are all the same so that the students can be graded
Yeah.
equally on.
A well-designed rubric that talks about the focuses that should be in all of them rather than, the links didn't work or something like that. Good. Other thoughts? Things that you wished you had heard about when you came? We've got 10 more minutes.
Just really quick, one follow-up we do with case studies is having listened to a podcast episode or two. Like, those tend to be really well put together. It's fun because they actually do it in groups, so they listen all together, like old school radio listening. But
Yeah, and one groups is another part.
yeah,
I mean, having them to be able to have that discussion about what to do there, I think that's a big benefit of Susan's. Is sometimes when we have them in Canvas, they're doing it on their own, and they don't have that social learning, that ability to say, well, what would you do? How would I do that? After the fact, sometimes we do that, but otherwise, no. Karen, can you show me yours? Can you stop sharing?
Yeah. You wanna just click on the lunchtime one?
Yep. And what was this made in?
In Articulate Storyline,
Okay.
which I just applaud that program. It's expensive, but ultimately I think it's worth every penny. I mean, we've made such a huge variety of things, the possibilities for building in questions and embedding just an extraordinary variety of things is really powerful. Now, we're lucky we don't have the 360 version, which is an annual fee. We have the software on our computers, which we just dished it out to begin with, and now we own it to use. So we're lucky in that way, just because we've been using it for several years now.
And
Yeah, if you want me to
you
drive
had,
this or.
I can do it as well.
You can drive it.
On the activity sheet, you've got a link to a lab on Storyline. So if you want to go find out more about Storyline, and it
Yeah.
talks about both the original and the new 360.
Yeah, I don't know if you can get anything with 360 anymore, but again, and we, the four of us, basically put our heads down and figured it out. Because we didn't have people to do it for us, so we just kind of gutted it out, but are really universally happy that we did, because you can produce really amazing things. And the med school has gone to a huge proportion of online resources. So we had to develop online resources, and I think it's a really powerful tool to do it.
And even
Not
that,
as
you
expensive,
did it
but-
with 3 other people, so there was a
Mhm.
team that were able to solve problems with
Yes.
each other.
Yeah.
That's a good,
They have a good community too online.
yeah,
Mhm.
I've loved hearing
E-learning
that.
heroes, I think it is.
Yeah, very inspiring, get a lot of ideas from their site.
All right, we got learning objectives.
So it kind of gives you a scenario, young woman's getting ready for lunch, she's gonna go to the refrigerator and get her, so literally what nerve allows her to see which bag is hers?
Anybody?
Sniffing it out.
Yeah, I tried those.
Oh, sniffing it in this case, yeah, the vision comes later, yeah, good job.
All right, what's the right answer?
Olfactory.
Just type in number 1.
Oh,
So the way, and we've learned over the years that, I, the letter I. There you go, that should do it. So we've learned over the years that rather than having unlimited options to answer the questions, we give them 3 shots. So, they have a typo, they type in the wrong answer, what have you, they get 3, so it's a good moderate number of attempts that they get. And if they get it wrong, then we give them the feedback and they move on. So sorry for this.
He's not doing
Oh,
so
you
well.
did. You must have practiced.
No, I got it wrong, and
There it is.
I missed it.
You were close.
It was close.
So it's a big mix of question types, from fill in the blank to find the thing on a picture to multiple choice. So we try and give them a big variety and just weave together all kinds of content. And it's a linear design, so it's not like we, at least in this project, send them down different pathways, but just as an opportunity for them to bring together a lot of, seemingly disconnected ideas.
I had a good chance with that one, so. Sounds hard, just go.
So anyway, students have so many online materials at this point.
we get very little feedback because they are evaluated to death. And I don't know how many different online modules they do in a given week, so what little feedback we manage to get on these is very good, but we don't have really large numbers of feedback, which is disappointing, but enough that we kind of tweak the navigation of it, the feedback, the attempt numbers, et cetera, to try and just make it
So
better.
has anyone noticed that you can do this in Top Hat? In class, and have the students all sort of take, because in Top Hat, it lets you click on a hotspot, it shows up there, and then they could say, oh, you can do the parent share, some of you guys got it right, some of you guys got it wrong, do it again, look at that. That might be a fun way to do that. And that way it solves the problem of, I'm just doing this by myself and I have no idea. I can learn from my neighbors, which is kind of fun.
When you talk about it's expensive, what are we talking price wise?
I think when we first bought, well, there was an educational discount when we first bought it, it was $600 or $800 per person. So you can, I think you can have it on
Or
2 machines per license,
So
yeah.
if the license is licensing the developers on the host side or the?
It's a software.
The user side.
No,
Okay, there's no license for like.
the students is all free.
Gotcha.
Yeah, $1,400.
But that's not educational discounts. Educational discounts takes up about 30-40%.
Yeah.
But still, it's pricey. And the next year,
It is.
you have to buy the new version.
They
Or
update
how many
only
years?
every couple of years.
Yeah.
So I think 4 will probably come out in another year or 2 or something like that. But it's like every 4 or 5 years they upgrade, so you're good for quite a bit of
I
time.
think actually though, with like Storyline 2, if that's what you're on, I don't know if you already have an earlier version.
We have 3 at this point because we got a new staff member and to be able to share files, we upgraded the 3 of us that were on
Yeah, I
board.
know with Storyline, I'm pretty sure with Storyline 2, what happened was that they get a character suite or whatever, I don't know what they call it, character bundle.
Mhm.
And then with 2, and I don't know if it's because we had 360 within our sort of domain or who we work with, but it seemed like they forced it to be even though it was purchased with Storyline 2, that it was no longer available, we then had to like upgrade to the new character bundle or the yearly subscription for the character bundle. And I don't know if you folks use the characters, but
Not much.
so I don't know if you've encountered, anybody in your group has encountered that sort of, I just remember going into Storyline 2 and then trying to put in a character and said, no, you have to go do this
Oh.
rigmarole to go and get them again. And I think it was something like a yearly cost or something for the character bundle, even though we had purchased the bundle.
So what did we learn here? As I do my takeaways, what should I say? And are there any other questions that people have for anyone else?
You need to think really carefully about designing your.
Yeah, there's a lot about design, right? Design ahead of time. Simplify, and it's not just simplify in the content, but also the design of it, I guess, and the technology. The most long-lasting, sustainable ones are probably Word documents or PowerPoint slides or slide-based ones. Also the least expensive.
John, I don't know if it was mentioned at all, but like test.
Assessment, yeah.
Test and retest.
So, one more thing about assessment.
Test out your.
Right.
Yeah, QA.
Try it out a lot.
And try to break it.
And break it, oh yeah. Do any of you guys give students extra points for breaking your cases? That's one that I remember there was an instructor that talked about. If I make a mistake, tell me about my points. And people would be like, ooh, they listen very carefully in the class. Which is kind of fun. But assessment, so one of the benefits of using some of the tools like Articulate Storyline and Captivate is, I believe, that Captivate also, it plays with the Canvas toolbook, Canvas gradebook. So you don't have to go in and assess the cases by yourself and decide on your own. You can sort of have this got done right and it shows up in the gradebook. H5P allows you to do some very simple interactive stuff. It does not yet play with the gradebook though, and there's links in here for H5P. But it's fun to use, and it might be a great tool to have the students try out in making their own cases because it teaches them how to think and it's easy to deal with. Any other takeaways?
I'm just a developer, me is thinking about getting the content in and out of these things. It used to be that you put things in PowerPoint, it's gone, you can't never get it out again. And things have gotten better, but are there ways to port things in and out of storylines so that you can retain either like the
It makes HTML files, that's what you're playing. So you can do Flash or HTML. We force it to do HTML primarily, so we don't have as much problem with browsers. And then you can do whatever you want. It's kind of very specialized HTML. But a lot of times we start out with PowerPoints at first and keep those PowerPoints around. So we sort of have a structure, so we go to some other software, we can sort of figure out what's going on.
And then
Learn a lesson there.
At least with Storyline 360, there's a plugin with PowerPoint.
Yep.
That you can basically just design and develop within PowerPoint. You don't even need to go into the Storyline.
So you can import the entire PowerPoint and then mark it up from there. For
That's
the
how
actual
I
pieces.
created, because it was just easier to do it for my brain to make it in PowerPoint first, and then and it was nice because anything where I'd had a square, interpreted that as a button. So like if I had next as a square in PowerPoint, it automatically knew that was going to be a button, which was awesome.
there's no way to render a standalone file, right? Or is there? Because it seems like storyline, you need to be.
So we've got the room for the next half hour, so some of these technical conversations, feel free to do that. I'm gonna let you go if you need to go, and just remind you to please fill this out for me. And grab some more cookies and nice coffee on the way out. Thank you guys for coming. Case studies or cases, this is like a huge topic, and one of the fears that I had was that we would not be able to cover it all, which was true. Hopefully you're able to lead with something today. Okay, thank you very much.
So, you can compile, so that's what you compile.